My name is Courtney Jackson. I am 38 years old and I am the owner and executive pastry chef of Sugar and Silk Confections, a luxury boutique bakery nestled in the affluent heart of Newport, Rhode Island. When a wealthy, arrogant bride and her mother tried to use my race as a weapon to strip me of my dignity and my payment, I didn't react. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for the money I had rightfully earned. I simply smiled at them, signaled my assistant to start loading back into our refrigerated van and walked away. While their elite, $500,000 wedding was reduced to serving stale sheet cakes from a local supermarket, I spent that evening signing the most lucrative corporate contract of my entire career. Before I show you exactly how I turned their arrogance into a public humiliation and systematically dismantled their reputation, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story. It's a blueprint for taking your power back. My kitchen in Newport is a sanctuary of absolute, clinical precision. It does not look like a traditional bakery. There is no flour dusting the air, no chaotic clutter of pans. It looks more like a high-end laboratory wrapped in Italian white marble and brushed stainless steel. Everything in my workspace is meticulously controlled from the ambient humidity to the exact calibration of the ovens. I was trained in Paris, breaking my back under the unforgiving gaze of Michelin-starred chefs who accepted nothing short of perfection. My specialty is botanical sugar work, crafting edible flowers out of gum paste and isomalt that are so anatomically accurate, clients often try to water them. I do not just bake, I engineer edible art. Because of the echelon in which I operate, my business rules are ironclad. In the world of old money, Newport, where wealth is generational and entitlement is practically written into their DNA, a firm boundary is the only shield you have. Everything at Sugar and Silk Confections is governed by a strict, non-negotiable contract. I require a 50% non-refundable retainer to secure the date, and the remaining 50% is due upon delivery before the cake is fully assembled. No exceptions. The trouble began in early spring during the initial tasting consultation with the Hayes family. Kimberly Hayes was the bride, a woman who seemed to view a wedding not as a marriage, but as a coronation. Accompanying her was her mother, Margaret. Margaret was a woman who moved through the world wrapped in an invisible armor of privilege, clutching her Hermes Birkin bag like a shield. The moment they stepped into my pristine tasting room, I felt the atmospheric shift. Margaret's eyes immediately did the scan. It is a specific look I have endured my entire life. It is the swift, assessing sweep from the top of my neatly styled locks down to my crisp, white chef's coat and back up again. It is a look that silently calculates whether you belong in a room with them. Her smile was remarkably thin, a tight stretching of lips that entirely bypassed her eyes. I presented them with a tasting menu featuring complex flavor profiles, a Madagascar vanilla bean genoise soaked in elderflower syrup, and a dark chocolate entremet with a sharp passion fruit curd. They ate in relative silence. The only sound the soft clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates. When Margaret finally spoke, her tone dripped with that particular brand of venom disguised as polite curiosity. She wiped the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, looked at my wall where my framed Le Cordon Bleu diploma hung in plain sight, and then looked back at me. "The flavors are surprisingly robust," Margaret murmured, her voice laced with an undeniable condescension. "Did you learn these little family recipes from your grandmother in the South?" I felt the familiar cold stillness settle over my chest. It was a classic microaggression delivered with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades keeping people she deemed lesser in their designated boxes. She was deliberately erasing my formal, elite training, attempting to reduce my classical French expertise to a stereotype of a warm, uneducated domestic worker. I did not bristle. I did not point to the diploma. I simply kept my posture perfectly straight, letting the silence stretch out just a fraction of a second too long, forcing her to sit in the awkwardness of her own words. "I learned the foundational techniques in Paris," I replied, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotional currency she could spend. "But the execution is entirely my own." Kimberly, oblivious to the silent warfare, pushed the contract across the marble table. It was for a massive 7-tier structure adorned with cascading sugar peonies and intricate lace piping. It was an astronomical order, pushing into the 5-figure range. As Margaret took an elegant Mont Blanc pen from her purse to sign the bottom line, I watched the blue ink bleed into the heavy cardstock. A quiet, undeniable instinct flared in the back of my mind. The way Margaret pressed the pen down, the dismissive tilt of her chin, it all telegraphed a profound disrespect for my authority. As I looked at that wet signature, my intuition whispered a chilling certainty. This family had no intention of paying the final balance. They believed the rules did not apply to them. And as I would soon prove on the day of the wedding, my intuition is never wrong. Delivery days are exercises in controlled terror managed only by absolute clinical precision. The third Saturday in June was oppressively humid, the kind of heavy coastal Rhode Island air that makes sugar weep and structural frosting buckle. But inside the back of my custom retrofitted Mercedes Sprinter van, the climate control was locked at a crisp 62 degrees. We arrived at the Hayes family estate on the Landerhaven just past noon. The property was a sprawling monument to Gilded Age excess, featuring manicured lawns that sloped dramatically down to the Atlantic Ocean. The reception was being held in a massive, custom-built, glass-paneled marquee that easily cost more than most people's mortgages. The space was a chaotic hive of florists arguing over hydrangeas and lighting technicians adjusting crystal chandeliers. My assistant, a brilliant culinary student named David, and I carved out our sanctuary of quiet focus in the center of it all. Assembling a 17-tier wedding cake on site is less about baking and more about structural engineering. For 2 hours, the world outside our designated 10-foot radius ceased to exist. I used a surgical scalpel to trim the delicate edges of the sugar paste. I placed the final cascading branch of handcrafted ivory sugar peonies using fine-tipped tweezers, ensuring the shadows fell perfectly across the intricate edible lace that wrapped the bottom 3 tiers. When I finally stepped back and pulled off my latex gloves, the cake stood over 4 foot tall. It was flawless, a towering, monolithic masterpiece of culinary architecture. We were packing away the specialized tools when the atmospheric pressure in the marquee seemed to shift. The heavy rustle of silk and the sharp, rhythmic click of heels against the temporary hardwood flooring announced their arrival. Kimberly and Margaret Hayes walked in, flanked by a nervous-looking wedding planner who hovered a few steps behind them holding a clipboard like a shield. Kimberly was already in her custom Vera Wang gown looking frantic and flushed. Margaret, however, looked exactly as she had at the tasting, perfectly coiffed, entirely unbothered, and radiating a calculated predatory calm. She did not gasp when she saw the cake. She did not offer a polite compliment. Instead, Margaret began a slow, deliberate orbit around the table, her eyes scanning the immaculate tiers not with admiration but with the cold, appraising glare of a real estate developer looking for a structural flaw to exploit. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. I stood by my equipment cases, hands folded loosely behind my back, my posture perfectly neutral. I knew this game. I had seen this tactic play out in high-end retail boutiques and luxury car dealerships. It was the performative devaluation of goods executed right before a demand for a discount. Margaret finally stopped, tapping a perfectly manicured, neutral-toned fingernail against her chin. She sighed, a soft, theatrical sound of profound disappointment. "It's not quite what we envisioned, is it, Kimberly?" Margaret murmured, not looking at her daughter, keeping her gaze pinned to the middle tier. Kimberly, clearly catching her mother's cue, nervously wrung her hands. "I mean, the flowers are a bit heavy, maybe? It lacks refinement." Margaret continued, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, echoing tent. She finally turned to look at me, her eyes dead and cold. "The lace detailing, the way these sugar pieces cascade, it's a little too urban. We wanted something that breathed old-world nobility. This feels entirely too aggressive for an estate of this caliber." The word urban, it hung in the air between us. A heavy, ugly thing draped in the thin, transparent veil of an aesthetic critique. It was a dog whistle blown at an ear-splitting volume. She wasn't critiquing my piping technique. She was looking at the black woman who had created it and informing me that my presence, my art, and my authority were inherently incompatible with their standard of luxury. My pulse did not elevate. My breathing remained steady. I watched her reach into her Chanel handbag. According to the contract she had signed, the final balance of $10,000 was due in a certified cashier's check upon assembly. Instead, Margaret pulled out a thick, white envelope. She didn't hand it to me. She dropped it on the edge of the linen-draped cake table. "There is $2,000 in cash in that envelope," Margaret stated, her tone shifting from theatrical disappointment to the sharp, flat cadence of a dictator issuing a final decree. "That is more than generous for a product that completely misses the mark. You're going to take it, Courtney, because we both know you cannot disassemble this monstrosity and drive it back out of here without making an absolute fool of yourself in front of my entire vendor team." She offered a final, devastatingly hollow smile. It was the smile of a woman who was entirely convinced she had successfully cornered her prey. She believed my pride was tied to my desperation. She assumed that, as a small business owner, the sheer logistics of moving a 4-foot cake would force my hand. She believed I would lower my head, take the fraction of my earnings, and skulk out the service entrance. They turned their backs on me, already calling for the florist to adjust the centerpiece, entirely certain that I would take the money and leave. But Margaret Hayes, in all her generational arrogance and calculated cruelty, had fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. And more importantly, she had forgotten a very simple 3-word legal clause hidden in plain sight within the contract she had signed. The thick, white envelope sat on the pristine ivory linen of the display table, leaning slightly against the baseboard of the bottom tier. $2,000 in unbanded cash. It was the physical manifestation of Margaret Hayes' absolute certainty that she held all the leverage in the room. I did not reach for the envelope. I did not shift my weight or allow my breathing to grow shallow. I simply let the silence expand, filling the heavy, floral-scented air of the marquee. If there is one thing I have learned operating a luxury business as a black woman, it is the lethal danger of an immediate emotional response. The world expects us to be either endlessly accommodating or aggressively combative. Margaret was banking on one of those two reactions. She wanted me to either crumble into a subservient apology and accept the pittance or raise my voice in an angry, unhinged defense of my work, which would only validate her narrative that I was urban and unrefined. She was baiting a trap. I simply chose not to step into it. I looked at Margaret's face. The performative disappointment had vanished, replaced by a tight, victorious complacency. She was waiting for the surrender. Instead of arguing, I slowly reached into the deep breast pocket of my chef's coat. My movements were deliberately unhurried. I extracted a heavy stock, neatly folded piece of paper, the carbon copy of the original invoice and contract. The paper was crisp. The dark blue ink of her signature stark against the white background. I unfolded it and placed it flat on the table, right next to her envelope of cash. I smoothed the crease with a pad of my index finger, dragging the silence out for another excruciating 3 seconds. Then, I tapped my fingernail twice against a specific paragraph located near the bottom of the page. Article 4, Section B. I said, my voice barely above a murmur, but pitched to cut through the ambient noise of the surrounding florists and lighting crew. I am sure your attorneys are quite thorough, Margaret, but allow me to refresh your memory. Margaret's eyes flicked down to the paper, then back to me, her jaw tightening just a fraction of an inch. I kept my gaze locked softly on hers as I recited the clause from memory. Ownership and title of the commissioned goods remain solely with Sugar and Silk Confections until the final balance is rendered in full. In the event of a breach of payment terms upon delivery, the vendor retains the absolute right to repossess the goods immediately, without penalty. Kimberly, the bride, let out a nervous, breathless scoff. You can't be serious. The reception starts in 3 hours. You can't just take the cake. Margaret held up a manicured hand to silence her daughter, though her own composure was beginning to fray at the edges. She let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, a dry, brittle sound meant to project authority she was rapidly losing. Don't be dramatic, Courtney. Margaret sneered, leaning in slightly, trying to use her physical proximity to intimidate me. We both know you are going to drag a 4-foot cake back to your van. It would ruin the icing. It would ruin your precious creation. You have no leverage here. Take the $2,000 or you leave with nothing but a ruined pile of sugar. She didn't wait for my response. Margaret turned on her heel, her silk skirt swishing aggressively against the floorboards. "Come, Kimberly. Let's go to the main house and have a glass of Bollinger. The catering staff can move this envelope to the vendor payment box when she finally comes to her senses." They walked away, disappearing into the chaotic swirl of the marquee, entirely convinced that my silence was a sign of defeat. They assumed my ego as an artist would tether me to the cake, that I would rather see it displayed for a fraction of the cost than watch it be dismantled. If you're watching this and you've ever had to work twice as hard just to get half the respect, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is about what happens when you stop being polite and start keeping receipts. Stay with me. As the Hayes women vanished from sight, my assistant, David, stepped up beside me. His eyes were wide, darting from the envelope of cash to the towering masterpiece we had just spent hours assembling. "Chef," he asked, his voice tight with anxiety, "what do we do?" I picked up the contract, folded it with exactly the same precision I had used to open it, and slipped it back into my pocket. I did not touch the envelope of cash. I left it sitting there on the table, entirely abandoned. "We do exactly what the contract allows us to do, David," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "We dismantle. It takes 2 hours to properly assemble a 7-tier botanical sugar cake. It takes exactly 14 minutes to surgically deconstruct it if you no longer care about preserving the internal dowels. We moved with the cold, synchronized efficiency of a tactical extraction team." David brought the heavy-duty reinforced carrying boxes from the van. I didn't waste time being precious with the structural buttercream. I used my offset spatula to separate the tiers, lifting the massive, heavy rounds of cake and placing them into the sterile white boxes. The breathtaking cascading sugar peonies, the ones Margaret had deemed too urban, were swiftly unpinned and packed into padded containers. The other vendors in the tent began to stop and stare. The lead florist dropped a bundle of white roses. The lighting technician nearly fell off his ladder. In the high-stakes world of elite weddings, a vendor actively tearing down their own installation is something akin to a myth. It just doesn't happen. The unspoken rule of the industry is that the wealthy client always wins. By the time Margaret and Kimberly were likely finishing their first glass of vintage champagne in the air-conditioned sanctuary of the main house, confident in their little power play, David was sliding the final massive base tier into the back of our refrigerated Sprinter van. I walked back to the marquee one last time. The space where the centerpiece of the reception was supposed to stand was now just an empty table draped in ivory linen, bearing nothing but a white envelope containing $2,000. I closed the heavy doors of the van, the metallic thud echoing loudly in the driveway. As I turned the key in the ignition, I checked the dashboard clock. It was exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes until the first 500 elite guests were scheduled to enter that tent expecting a royal dessert. They thought I was bluffing, but Margaret Hayes was about to learn a very hard lesson. When you write the rules, you never have to bluff. The heavy wrought iron gates of the Landerhaven estate receded in the rearview mirror of my van, blending seamlessly into the obscenely manicured rhododendron bushes that shielded the old money elite from the rest of the world. Inside the cab, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the refrigeration unit chilling the back cargo hold to a perfect 62 degree. Beside me in the passenger seat, David was practically vibrating with a mixture of raw adrenaline and absolute terror. He kept checking the side mirror, half expecting Margaret Hayes' private security to come chasing down the avenue. "Chef," he finally exhaled, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of what we had just done. "They're going to destroy us. They know everyone. They sit on every board in Newport. The reviews, the lawsuits." I kept my eyes on the winding, sun-dappled coastal road. I did not grip the steering wheel tighter. My heart rate remained at a steady resting pace. Panic is a luxury afforded to those who haven't planned for the worst-case scenario. I had spent my entire life planning for exactly this kind of demographic hostility. "David," I said, my tone entirely flat, grounding his spiraling anxiety. "You cannot destroy someone who holds the receipts. Furthermore, we currently possess a perishable, $25,000 asset in the back of this vehicle. We are not going back to the kitchen to mourn it. We are going to reallocate it." I tapped the touchscreen on the dashboard, scrolling through my encrypted contacts. I didn't need to look for a buyer. I needed a stage. I bypassed the wedding planners and the corporate event coordinators, stopping on a name that commanded far more influence in Rhode Island than Margaret Hayes ever could. Victoria Channing. Victoria was the chairwoman of the Ocean Drive Children's Foundation. That evening, just 3 miles away in the grand ballroom of the historic Rosecliff Mansion, she was hosting their annual Black Tie Charity Gala. It was the single most exclusive philanthropic event of the summer season, a gathering of senators, tech billionaires, and legacy families who actually possessed the wealth that the Hayes family only pretended to still have. The Bluetooth speaker chimed twice before connecting. "Courtney darling," Victoria's voice floated through the speakers, sharp and perpetually hurried. "Tell me you're calling to say Victoria magically cloned herself and can cater my VIP lounge tonight. My current pastry chef is having an existential crisis over the macaron towers." "Better, Victoria," I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of the morning's conflict. "I am calling to offer you a donation. A 7-tier, custom-designed botanical sugar installation. Madagascar vanilla bean, dark chocolate entremet, passion fruit curd. It is a certified masterpiece. It stands 4 foot tall and it is currently sitting in my climate-controlled van. Completely complimentary. A gift to the foundation." There was a profound, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Victoria Channing was a woman who dealt in millions, yet she understood the sheer, unparalleled value of what I was offering. "Courtney, a piece like that from Sugar and Silk," as she paused, the gears in her formidable mind turning. "Are you absolutely certain? Consider it a last-minute stroke of philanthropic inspiration," I said smoothly. "I simply need your loading dock cleared in exactly 12 minutes. Done." Victoria breathed, the thrill of the acquisition evident in her voice. "The center stage is yours." While I was navigating the Sprinter van toward the glittering epicenter of Newport's true elite, a very different kind of reality was setting in back at the Landerhaven estate. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, the golden hour began to cast long, elegant shadows across the manicured lawns. The string quartet had taken their places on the terrace, tuning their instruments in the salty breeze. Inside the grand house, Kimberly Hayes, draped in of custom Vera Wang silk, decided she wanted a private, preemptive viewing of the reception tent before the first 500 guests began to arrive. Accompanied by the photographer to capture her candid reaction to the decor, Kimberly walked across the lawn. Margaret followed closely behind, a glass of vintage Bollinger resting elegantly in her hand, her face a mask of supreme, untouchable confidence. Kimberly pushed through the heavy fabric drapes of the marquee entryway. The photographer raised his camera, waiting for the gasp of sheer delight. The gasp came, but it was a sharp, oxygen-starved sound of absolute horror. Kimberly stopped dead in her tracks. The Vera Wang silk pulled around her feet. She stared at the center of the room, her perfectly contoured face draining of all color. The raised, circular platform where the magnificent 4-foot masterpiece was supposed to stand was a vacant void. There was no cake. There was no edible lace. There were no sugar peonies catching the ambient light. There was only a massive, empty table draped in wrinkled ivory linen. And right in the center of that emptiness, sitting exactly where I had left it, was the crisp white envelope containing their $2,000 insult. Margaret bumped into her daughter from behind, annoyed by the sudden stop. "Kimberly, what on earth are you?" Margaret's voice died in her throat. The champagne flute slipped just a fraction of an inch in her grip. The calculated, predatory calm that she wore like a second skin fractured, shattering into a million jagged pieces of genuine panic. For the first time in her insulated, privileged life, her money and her audacity had failed to bend reality to her will. They had called my bluff, but I hadn't been bluffing. I had simply enforced the boundaries they believed they were too important to respect. As Margaret began to scream at the wedding planner, frantically demanding her assistant scour every stop and shop and local grocery store within a 50 miles radius for whatever mass-produced sheet cakes they could find, my van was backing into the loading dock of the Rosecliff mansion. The Hayes family was about to serve stale, plastic-wrapped supermarket sponge to the most judgmental society crowd on the eastern seaboard. Meanwhile, my masterpiece, the one they had deemed too urban to grace their presence, was being carefully wheeled into a room filled with the most powerful investors in the country. The reception tent at the Landerhaven estate was a masterpiece of expensive illusion, but illusions require absolute structural integrity to survive the night. Without the commanding presence of the centerpiece, the vast, decorated space felt undeniably hollow. Margaret Hayes had dispatched her fleet of an assistants in a state of muted, feral panic. I could only imagine the sheer, undiluted humiliation the wedding planner felt, sweating through her tailored silk suit in the fluorescent-lit aisles of a commercial discount grocery store on a Saturday afternoon. With only hours to spare, there was no artisan bakery to save them. The assistants were forced to load their shopping carts with mass-produced, rectangular sheet cakes encased in clear plastic clam shells. These were baked goods adorned with fiercely bright artificial icing and plastic balloon rings, the kind of cakes meant to be served on paper plates at a chaotic child's birthday party, not plated on gold-rimmed Limoges porcelain for the eastern seaboard's elite. 3 miles down the coast, a vastly different reality was unfolding. Under the gilded, frescoed ceiling of the Rose Cliff Ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive, obscure perfumes and the quiet murmur of authentic, unassailable power. The Children's Foundation Gala was the zenith of the Newport social calendar. There was no need for the frantic, performative displays of wealth that Margaret Hayes relied upon. In this room, wealth was simply the oxygen. When Victoria Channing laid eyes on my creation in the staging area, she didn't speak for a full minute. The formidable chairwoman simply stepped back, her eyes tracing the impossible geometry of the edible lace, the hyper-realistic droop of the botanical sugar peonies. She didn't ask about my grandmother's recipes. She recognized high-level, meticulous engineering when she saw it. At 9 o'clock, the moment of truth arrived back at the Landerhaven estate. The filet mignon had been cleared. The band transitioned to a softer, anticipatory tempo. In a normal sequence of elite events, this is a highly theatrical moment. The bride and groom step beneath a concentrated spotlight to cut the first slice of a towering confection. Instead, the catering staff, looking thoroughly mortified and avoiding eye contact with the tables, emerged from the prep tents carrying broad silver trays. Loaded onto these trays were squares of aggressively yellow sponge cake slathered in a thick, waxy, hyper-sweet frosting. As the plates were set down before the region's most judgmental socialites, the silence that fell over the marquee was deafening. It wasn't a respectful hush. It was the sharp, collective intake of breath that precedes a major social scandal. I didn't need to be there to see it. I knew exactly how Margaret's peers operated. They would smile thinly, their eyes darting to one another in silent communication. They would take one polite bite of the chemical-tasting confection, and then the whispers would begin behind linen napkins. They would dismantle Margaret's carefully curated reputation with the same surgical precision I had used to dismantle my cake. Kimberly sat at the sweetheart table, tears silently ruining her professional makeup, while her mother stared at the cheap vanilla sponge as if it were a bomb about to detonate. Her social currency was evaporating in real time. Simultaneously, at 9:30, the heavy velvet curtains at the far end of the Rosecliff Ballroom, the string quartet paused and the room's ambient lighting shifted, creating a singular dramatic pool of illumination in the center of the polished dance floor. The cake was rolled out on a custom mirrored cart. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd of 500 investors, senators, and legacy matriarchs. Not a murmur of scandal, but of sheer unadulterated awe. The towering structure stood like an ivory monument. The isomalt sugar petals catching the spotlight, looking impossibly delicate and fiercely triumphant. Victoria Channing stepped up to the acrylic podium, tapping the microphone once. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing through the cavernous historic space. "Tonight is about giving and about elevating our community. It is my absolute honor to present a late, but profoundly breathtaking addition to our evening. This masterpiece, a true work of culinary architecture, was generously donated just hours ago. Please direct your attention and your applause to the visionary behind Sugar and Silk Confections, Chef Courtney Jackson." The applause was not polite. It was a roar. The flashbulbs of the society photographers erupted from the edges of the room, immortalizing the cake in a flurry of blinding white light. I stood near the velvet-roped entrance of the kitchen, hands clasped loosely behind my back, watching the room stand up for me. They were all on their feet, applauding the very artistry, the very presence that Margaret Hayes had deemed too urban for her daughter's tent. The juxtaposition was flawlessly balanced. While Margaret sat in a suffocating silence, choking on the taste of cheap frosting and the ashes of her social standing, I was being canonized by the only demographic in the city that actually held the keys to the kingdom. But the night was only the beginning. Margaret had fundamentally underestimated my pride, but by Monday morning, she would learn that she had entirely miscalculated my understanding of the law. The nightmare for the Hayes family wasn't ending with a ruined dessert service. It was merely the appetizer. Monday mornings at Sugar and Silk Confections are defined by a specific, restorative quiet. The chaotic energy of the weekend wedding rush has been scrubbed away with industrial citrus cleaner, leaving only the low, ambient hum of the commercial refrigerators and the rich, dark scent of roasting espresso beans. It is my favorite time of the week. It is a time for resetting, for recalibrating, and occasionally for watching the predictable mechanics of a wounded ego try to assert dominance. The heavy glass door of the bakery swung open precisely at 9:15. A courier in a sharply pressed uniform walked in, breaking the morning silence to drop a stiff cardboard FedEx priority envelope onto the marble counter. It was from a white shoe law firm based in Providence, one known for representing old money estates and handling discreet, expensive divorces. I did not open it immediately. I finished steaming the milk for my macchiato, poured it with deliberate slowness, and took a sip before finally pulling the adhere strip on the cardboard envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter, accompanied by a formal notice of intent to sue, printed on heavy, cream-colored linen paper that felt thick and expensive between my fingertips. Margaret Hayes was demanding $80,000 in damages. The allegations were a masterclass in performative victimhood. Breach of contract, willful destruction of property, and severe emotional distress caused by the malicious sabotage of her daughter's wedding. It was a terrifying document, designed to bully a small business owner into immediate, panic submission. I set the letter down next to my espresso. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I did not feel a flicker of fear. I only felt a profound, clinical pity for a woman who was so accustomed to wielding her privilege that she never learned to calculate actual risk. I walked back to my office, opened my laptop, and drafted a very brief email to my attorney, Marcus, a man who specialized in corporate litigation and possessed a temperament as cold and unyielding as a glacier. I attached 2 items to the email. The first was a high-resolution, scanned PDF of the original contract with Margaret's signature clearly visible at the bottom, directly beneath the clause detailing my right to repossess unpaid merchandise. The second attachment was a video file. What Margaret and Kimberly had failed to notice in their rush to dismiss me the marquee was the small, discreet, high-definition security lens mounted on the interior roof of my refrigerated Sprinter van. Because we frequently loaded tens of thousands of dollars worth of inventory, the camera recorded a wide, sweeping angle of everything within 20 feet of the rear doors. The footage was entirely without audio, but the visual narrative was devastatingly clear. It showed Margaret and Kimberly strutting up to the display table. It showed Margaret dropping the envelope on the linen, turning her back, and walking away without ever tendering the final balance. It showed me standing there, entirely unthreatening, before calmly packing my intellectual property back into its boxes. It was irrefutable, time-stamped proof of her breach of contract. Marcus sent the law firm his response an hour later. It was a single, devastating page. He included a still frame from the video, a copy of the contract, and a polite but icy notification that if they proceeded with this frivolous litigation, we would immediately file a public countersuit for defamation, extortion, and racial discrimination. We would subpoena the wedding planner, the florist, and the caterers who witnessed the event. We would drag the entire humiliating ordeal into the public record. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, Marcus forwarded me a 2-line email from Margaret's attorneys. The lawsuit was formally withdrawn. The Hayes family had chosen the silence of their own shame over the public exposure of their arrogance. I closed my laptop, the sharp click of the screen satisfying in the quiet office. At exactly 2:30, the brass bell above the front door chimed again. I stepped out of the office to find a man standing in the center of the showroom. He was in his late 50s, wearing a bespoke charcoal gray suit that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. He wasn't looking at the display cases. He was looking at the framed cordon bleu diploma on the wall. "The passion fruit curd," he said, turning to look at me, his voice carrying the calm resonance of a man accustomed to making major decisions. "It was the most extraordinary thing I tasted at the Rosecliff Gala on Saturday night. Victoria Channing tells me you are entirely self-directed." "I am," I replied, folding my hands naturally in front of my apron. He extended a hand. "I am Harrison Cole. I sit on the executive board for the Oak Haven Hotel Group. We are currently restructuring the culinary contracts for our premium properties across the eastern seaboard. I have spent the last 6 months looking for a pastry chef with the exact architectural precision you displayed on that stage." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek, embossed business card. "I don't want you for a single event, Chef Jackson. I want Sugar and Silk Confections as our exclusive vendor for all Tier 1 corporate galas. We are prepared to offer a multi-year retainer." I looked at the heavy card stock in my hand. It was an elite, $1 million commercial contract. It was the kind of opportunity that redefined a career, handed to me by the very people Margaret Hayes had desperately tried to impress with her fake, plastic-wrapped supermarket cake. I looked back up at Harrison Cole and smiled. "My attorney will be expecting your call. True power is never loud. It does not need to slam its fists on a table or raise its voice to demand respect. True power is knowing the exact, unshakable value of your own work. It is writing your own rules, holding your boundaries with the strength of reinforced steel, and quietly allowing those who refuse to respect you to drown in the shallow waters of their own arrogance." If this reminded you of a battle you had to win in silence, share this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I'll see you in the next story.